Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
For, thousands of years, sleep has been this huge mystery, right? We've looked at dreams, tried to figure them out. What do they mean psychologically, culturally? But there's always been this deeper scientific question underneath it all. When we're really out, deep asleep, are we actually gone? Completely unconscious? Well, the latest science, this big international project, it suggests something pretty startling, something that kind of flips decades of thinking on its head. Maybe we're not entirely gone after all. So today we're doing a deep dive into some really groundbreaking stuff. We've got a health news piece and, importantly, a really dense scientific paper. They detail this massive new dream research project. Our mission here is to unpack this huge database, it's called NREM, and explore its main finding, that when we dream, especially outside of that typical REM phase, parts of our brain might actually be, acting partially awake.
Yeah, and it's crucial to get right up front what a huge challenge this project tackled. For decades, dream research was just scattered. If you look back, studies trying to find, the brain basis for consciousness in sleep. They had tiny sample sizes, maybe a few dozen awakenings, and on top of that, no two labs did things the same way. Methodologically, conceptually, it was all over the place.
So comparing results was basically impossible.
Pretty much. It really stalled any kind of unified theory of consciousness during sleep. The data was messy, it cost a fortune to collect, and it just sat in silos in different labs.
It sounds less like science building on itself and more like trying to piece together a puzzle with pieces from totally different boxes.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that's exactly why this international effort, this DREAM database, is such a big deal. It's this unified push for rigorous, standardized data, but at a massive scale. Finally, to really push the science of consciousness forward, it's like building the essential infrastructure for the field.
And the first look at what this database holds, it's already shaking things up.
Oh, absolutely. The main takeaway is kind of twofold. First, dreaming happens way more often throughout the whole night than we used to think. It's definitely not just a rapid eye movement or REM sleep thing. And second, this is the really surprising part. When people have these experiences during non-REM sleep, the really deep, quiet sleep stages, the brain's electrical activity actually looks, strikingly similar to being awake.
Whoa. So the brain is basically creating this inner conscious world while the body's in its deepest rest state. Okay, we definitely need to unpack this. Let's start with how they even managed to build something capable of showing that. Okay, before we get into the juicy results, let's talk about building this DREAM resource. DREAM stands for Dream Electroencephalography and Mentation Database. You mentioned the data problem, but maybe unpack a bit more how those small studies really held things back.
Well, think about it. If you're hunting for these really subtle brain signals, the neural correlates of having a dream, you need a ton of data to see the signal through the noise. Sleeping brain activity is inherently messy, electrically speaking. So your typical study with maybe 50, maybe 100 awakenings across just a handful of people, it just didn't have the statistical power. Findings were often shaky, hard to reproduce. People worried, quite rightly, about generalizing from just one lab-specific setup. It couldn't scale.
And running those sleep studies, the polysomnography, it's incredibly expensive, right? And time-consuming for participants. Getting hundreds of hours of good sleep data sounds like a logistical beast.
It really was a major barrier. Just the logistics were enough to slow the field down. And that's why DREAM, being this centralized open-source collection, is such a game changer. It wasn't one lab. It was this huge collaboration. We're talking, 53 authors, 37 institutions, 13 countries, all pooling their data. Decades of work.
Wow. Okay. That definitely solves the scale issue. So how big are we talking for this initial data set?
This first release is really unprecedented. It combines data from 505 different people, and that gives us records from over 2,600 separate standardized awakenings. Now, these came from 20 different studies that the consortium members had already run, and the idea is it's an expanding resource, it'll keep growing, but even this starting point just fundamentally changes the statistical muscle available to researchers.
Okay, but pulling data from 20 studies, they must have used different gear, right? Different EEG caps, different ways of waking people, different software even. How on earth do you standardize that? How do you make sure data from, say, Germany is truly comparable to data from Brazil?
That standardization piece, that was absolutely the core challenge. And it took meticulous, painstaking work. The whole consortium had to agree on a single, unified system. Not just for classifying sleep stages, but crucially, for classifying the subjective dream reports too. They brought together all these brain activity records, mostly electroencephalography, EEG, which measures electrical signals, but also some magnetoencephalography, MEG, which measures magnetic fields. We often just say EE for short. And they had to standardize the raw signals themselves, things like filtering, sampling rates. Then, crucially, they standardized how the subjective verbal reports linked to that brain activity were collected and categorized.
So the basic unit, the datum as they call it, it's always a matched pair.
Exactly. It's never just the brain recording alone, or just the dream report. Each data point in dream is a segment of me brain recording at least 20 seconds, right up to the moment they woke the person up, tied directly to a standardized classification of what that person said they were experiencing just before waking. It's this tight coupling of objective brain signal and subjective experience report that finally makes large-scale, reliable comparisons possible.
Right. So with this incredible standardized data set in hand, let's tackle those classic ideas about sleep. For ages, doctors, the public, everyone thought dreaming basically was REM sleep. Maybe let's quickly refresh what those sleep stages are, just as a rehook for everyone.
Sure. So the standard model gives us 5 main stages. You've got wakefulness, obviously. Then the non-rapid eye movement stages, NREM1, NREM2, and NREM3. NREM3 is often called deep sleep or slow wave sleep. And then finally, REM sleep. The traditional thinking was that NREM was mostly about physical rest, not much going on mentally.
And NREM3, that's the one defined by those really big, slow brain waves, right? Delta waves, super low frequency, like the brain's just deeply synchronized, resting, not exactly prime time for complex thoughts or experiences.
The classic picture, yeah. Deep rest. REM sleep, on the other hand, looks very different. The EEG shows low amplitude, faster activity, almost like being awake. You get the rapid eye movements, obviously. And the body's muscles are almost completely paralyzed. That's muscle atonia. So it looks like this active brain in a paralyzed body. The belief was maybe 90% of dreaming happened right there in REM.
Okay, but the dream data comes along and says, hold on, not so fast. The picture is way more complex. What did it actually find about how common dreaming is across all the stages?
Well, it did confirm REM as a hotspot. About 85% of awakenings from REM sleep came with a dream report. No surprise there. But the really big news was NREM sleep. The data showed that dreaming accompanies a huge chunk of NREM awakenings, somewhere between 40% and 60%, depending on which NREM stage you're looking at. It's undeniable.
40 to 60%. That's massive. That suggests that roughly half the time you're in what we call dreamless sleep, you might actually be having some kind of conscious experience, even if you don't remember it later.
Precisely. And now, with this much data, we can see the pattern really clearly. There's a definite gradient. The likelihood of having a conscious experience goes down as you go deeper into NREM sleep. So, for example, wake someone from NREM stage 1, that light sleep, right as you're drifting off. They reported some kind of experience as striking 88% of the time. But wake them from NREM stage 3, that deep, slow-wave sleep, the number drops, but it's still remarkably high at 48%, nearly half the time, even in the deepest sleep stage.
48% in NREM3. What does that gradient tell us physiologically? Why would deep sleep only suppress dreaming by about half compared to that light NREM1 sleep?
It strongly suggests that the very thing defining NREM3, that synchronized high-amplitude, slow delta wave activity, is actively sort of competing with or suppressing the kind of complex neural firing needed for a rich conscious experience. NREM1 has less of that synchronization, less delta power, so it's just an easier state for these more wake-like patterns to emerge. But the fact that you still get reports almost half the time from NREM3, that proves consciousness isn't just tied to the overall sleep stage. It must depend on more transient, maybe localized flickers of brain activity within that stage.
Okay, so managing reports from 2,600 awakenings across 20 studies, they needed a really strict way to define what counted as a dream or an experience. How did they standardize the subjective side?
They came up with 3 really clear categories to keep everything consistent. First was experience. That means the person actually recalled specific content that could tell you what happened in the dream. Second was experience without recall. You might have heard this called white dreams. This is when someone wakes up with a really strong feeling, a definite impression they were just experiencing something vivid, but poof, the actual content is gone. They can't remember any details.
The classic, I know I was dreaming, but I can't remember what about feeling.
Exactly. And it's an important category because it acknowledges how fragile memory is right upon waking. The third category was simply no experience. The person had no recall and no feeling of having just dreamed either. This framework let all the different labs classify reports the same way.
Makes sense. But we have to hit on the limitation here. Getting these reports means waking people up. And everyone knows that feeling sleep inertia, you're groggy, confused. How much can we really trust the accuracy of these reports, even if they're categorized well?
That's an absolutely critical point. It's the inherent weakness of relying on subjective reports. Sleep inertia definitely muddies the waters. People get confused, memory fades incredibly fast. And that's precisely why the database needed to be so enormous. You need thousands of these somewhat noisy data points to see the real trends statistically, like that 40-60% NREM dreaming phase. And, this need for verbal reports means we're always kind of interrupting the very thing we want to study. We can't easily observe dream consciousness just unfolding naturally. The only exceptions are really rare cases, like lucid dreaming, where someone can signal consciously, maybe with eye movements, without being fully woken up. For almost everything else, those objective brain activity signals are our best, maybe our only, truly reliable witnesses.
Okay, so the objective data comes to the rescue. We've established dreaming is common, even in non-REM sleep. Now for the really fascinating bit, the electrophysiology. What did the raw MEG signals, the brainwaves themselves, actually show during those NREM dreams?
This is where it gets really interesting, you're right, because the MEG data provides really strong support for this idea they're calling the covert wake hypothesis. The core finding is this. When someone reports having a dream experience during NREM sleep, even in that deep NREM 3 stage, their brain activity fundamentally shifts. It stops looking like deep sleep and starts looking much more like the brain activity of someone who is awake.
Wow. So the mind's experience engine is kind of overriding the body's deep rest program. How do they measure that shift objectively? What's the telltale sign that deep sleep is being, less deep?
The main marker, the most consistent one, is a drop in that low-frequency delta power. Remember those big, slow, high-amplitude waves between 0.5 and 4 hertz that define deep sleep? Well, those get suppressed. Whenever a conscious experience was reported, whether it was in REM or NREM, there was consistently less power in those slow delta waves. The brain is literally less deeply asleep when you're dreaming, even if your body is still out. And they confirmed this using some sophisticated automatic sleep scoring analyses. These algorithms look at the overall probability distribution of brain activity patterns. They call them hypnodensities. When they fed the algorithm the brain data from NREM periods where a dream was reported, the analysis showed an increased probability, a shift, towards the patterns typical of wakefulness.
Wait, hang on. So the computer algorithm, which only knows how to classify sleep stages based on the electrical patterns it sees, it basically looked at a dreaming NREM brain and thought, this looks a bit awake.
That's essentially the takeaway, yes. The neural signature of having a conscious experience, even without any input from the outside world, looks similar enough to wakefulness that the algorithm, just based on the brainwaves, judges it to be less asleep than a non-dreaming NREM state. That's really powerful objective evidence.
That points towards something pretty fundamental, doesn't it? A kind of consistency. Like the basic brain machinery for having any subjective experience, whether you're awake looking around or asleep having a bizarre dream, might rely on similar core processes.
Exactly. That apparent consistency is key. It lets researchers start linking specific features of the dream content back to brain patterns we already understand from studying wakefulness.
Yeah.
This is crucial if we want to move beyond just detecting if someone is dreaming to maybe figuring out what they're dreaming about.
Can you give an example or two of those kinds of correlations they found?
Sure. One interesting finding related to emotions in dreams. Whether the dream felt positive or negative, stressful or calm, this correlated with changes in something called frontal alpha asymmetry. That's basically a difference in the power of alpha waves, those 8-12 hertz waves between the left and right frontal parts of the brain. We know from waking studies that the frontal lobes are heavily involved in emotion regulation, approach avoidance behaviors. So seeing that pattern pop up with dream emotions makes sense. Another example, the perception of content in dreams. Like if the dream involved vivid visual imagery or hearing sounds clearly. This correlated with increased activity in high-frequency gamma waves. And importantly, that gamma activity was seen in the brain regions that normally handle those senses when we're awake. The occipital cortex for vision, the temporal cortex for hearing, the parietal regions for spatial sense.
So connecting the dots. It suggests that when the brain kicks into gear to create a conscious experience during sleep, it doesn't use some weird separate dream system. It actually seems to hijack or reactivate the very same neural pathways it uses for seeing, feeling, and thinking when we're awake. The only difference is the input source, it's internally generated instead of coming from our eyes and ears.
That seems to be the picture emerging, yes, a sort of covert, internally driven wakefulness.
Okay, so if there are objective brain markers for dreaming, even subtle ones, that naturally leads to the next big question. Can we predict it? Could we, say, use artificial intelligence to look at someone's brainwaves and predict, before we wake them, whether they're likely having a dream right now?
That was exactly the hypothesis they tested. And, well, they had some pretty significant success. They trained AI algorithms specifically to distinguish between experience and no experience reports, using only the electroencephalography features recorded just before they woke the participant up.
What kind of features did the AI latch onto? It must be more complex than just looking for less slow-wave activity, especially in REM sleep, which is already pretty fast and messy, right?
Right. They extracted features in two main ways. First, they used the more traditional measures, things called power spectral density features, PSD for short. This is the classic approach. You measure how much power or energy is present in the standard brainwave frequency bands, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. It basically tells you about the overall distribution, like are slow waves dominant or are fast waves dominant. But second, and this turned out to be really important, they used a much more sophisticated set of measures. These are called nonlinear time series characteristics, specifically set known as catch-22 features. Now, these 22 features capture more complex aspects of the brain, signal things like its predictability, its randomness or entropy, its overall dynamic complexity. They pick up on subtle, nonlinear patterns that the simple power analysis might totally miss, especially in a busy state like REM sleep.
Okay, so PSD is like checking the overall volume across different radio frequencies, while Catch-22 is like analyzing the intricate structure and patterns within the music itself.
That's a really good analogy, actually, and the results from the AI classification really highlighted the difference. It clearly showed that information relevant to the conscious experience can be decoded from EEG in both non-REM and REM sleep.
So how well did it work? They used that AUC metric area under the curve where 0.5 is just guessing, right? What did they find for NREM versus REM, and what does that difference tell us?
The results were quite revealing. For NREM sleep, the AI did best using those simpler power spectral density features. It achieved an average prediction accuracy, an AUC, of 0.586. Now, that's not amazing, but it's definitely better than chance, statistically significant. And it makes sense, right? Because the main change in NREM dreaming seems to be that reduction in delta power, which is a straightforward PSD feature. But for REM sleep, the PSD features didn't work nearly as well. Instead, the best performance came from using those complex nonlinear Catch-22 features. There, the AI reached an average AUC of 0.700.
Okay, 0.700 AUC is actually pretty good, especially trying to predict something subjective from just scalp EEG signals. But the difference is key, isn't it? Simple power features work okay for NREM dreams, but you need the complex, nonlinear stuff for REM dreams. What does that imply?
It implies something fundamental about the two states. In NREM, the baseline brain state is relatively simple, highly synchronized. So the emergence of a conscious experience might manifest primarily as a disruption of that simplicity, less synchrony, less slow wave power. That's easier for the AI to spot with basic PSC features. In REM sleep, however, the brain is already in a highly active, complex, almost wake-like state. So telling the difference between REM sleep with a dream and REM sleep without a dream requires looking at more subtle features, the actual complexity and dynamics of the signal. The fact that the nonlinear Catch-22 analysis was needed suggests that consciousness in REM is potentially built on more intricate, higher dimensional neural activity patterns.
Fascinating. So, stepping back, what does this budding ability to predict or decode consciousness from brainwaves mean beyond just understanding dreams? What are the bigger implications?
Oh, the implications are potentially huge, especially for the whole field studying the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCC. Dreaming gives us this unique natural experiment. Think about it. It's a genuine conscious experience, often vivid, but it happens without any input coming in from your senses and without you physically acting on the world. This makes the dreaming brain a potentially ideal place to isolate the NCC to find the bare minimum brain activity needed for consciousness itself, stripped of sensory processing and motor commands. And if we can really nail down those patterns that signify consciousness when someone is asleep and disconnected, maybe we can then use those patterns to look for consciousness in clinical situations where people are disconnected for other reasons.
Right. That connects straight into some really profound clinical areas, like trying to detect awareness in patients who seem unresponsive.
Exactly. Patients with conditions like unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, sometimes called a vegetative state, often just looking at their behavior doesn't tell us if there's any inner conscious awareness left. If we could find reliable, objective brain markers of consciousness, derived partly from studying dreams, it could offer a way to detect that awareness even when the person can't communicate it.
And you mentioned anesthesia earlier. What about preventing that terrifying situation of intraoperative awareness, being conscious during surgery?
Yes, that's another critical area. People who experience intraoperative awareness sometimes describe it almost like a dream, albeit often a terrifying one. If the algorithms developed using the DREAM database can reliably detect that subtle shift from complete drug-induced unconsciousness toward a covert wake state, even in a paralyzed patient, well, then we could potentially monitor anesthetic depth much more accurately, using brain signals directly, and help ensure everyone stays fully unconscious during surgery. The DREAM database isn't just about dreams. It's potentially a key to decoding silent consciousness in many different states.
Now, as exciting as all this is, especially this covert wake idea backed by the brain data, the original researchers were careful to frame these as initial findings, right?
Absolutely. That's just good scientific practice. They explicitly state that these particular findings about NREM activity looking wake-like are, for now, exploratory. They kind of go beyond the scope of this initial paper, as they put it. The main goal of this specific paper was really to introduce and validate the DREAM database itself as a resource. These fascinating findings about covert wakefulness, they basically serve as strong justification for needing that resource to conduct more focused, rigorous follow-up studies.
And the database itself, its very existence and structure, is also meant to be a kind of corrective, isn't it? A way to push back against some maybe less than ideal research habits from the past.
Yes, they're very open about that. A major goal is to combat long-standing problems in science, like the file drawer effect, where studies that don't find exciting results just never get published, which biases the whole scientific picture. They also want to help counteract statistical issues like hacking or data dredging, where researchers might consciously or unconsciously keep analyzing their data in different ways until they stumble upon a statistically significant result, even if it doesn't mean much. By making this huge, standardized data set openly available, DREAM makes it much easier to do things like registered reports. That's where scientists pre-register their exact hypothesis, methods, and analysis plan before they even look at the data. It promotes transparency and reproducibility, which is crucial.
Right, more data sharing, pre-registration. It forces a higher standard, especially in complex fields like neuroscience, where studies are expensive and data can be noisy. It's about building a more solid foundation. So with this amazing resource now available to scientists worldwide, we can shift from what we've just learned to thinking about the next big questions. For you, the listener, armed with this new understanding, what are the mysteries that the DREAM database now puts within reach?
Oh, there are still huge questions. We've made progress in detecting the presence or absence of dreaming, right? But the next frontier is decoding the specific contents. What does the brain signal look like when you're seeing something in a dream versus thinking something abstract versus feeling a strong emotion? Answering that means meticulously correlating the fine-grained details from thousands of dream reports with the subtle patterns in the MEG data. That's a massive computational task, but now potentially feasible.
And the scale of the database must finally allow researchers to really dig into individual differences, too.
Exactly. Why do some people remember dreams almost every night, high recallers, while others swear they never dream at all?
Oh,
Are there actual differences in brain structure or function? Or maybe just differences in how easily they wake up or how good their memory consolidation is during sleep? With 500 plus participants, you can start to meaningfully compare groups. And then there's the big one, lucid dreaming. What is happening neurologically when someone becomes aware that they are dreaming while still asleep and can sometimes even control the dream narrative, unlocking the difference between regular dreaming and that self-aware lucid state? That's arguably one of the ultimate goals here. It potentially offers a direct window into understanding self-awareness and maybe even volition, all within the sleeping brain. Hashtag outro.
So the big takeaway from this deep dive, I think, is pretty profound. This DREAM database represents a huge step forward. It confirms, with serious statistical weight, that conscious experiences aren't just confined to REM sleep, they're happening much more widely throughout the night. And maybe most crucially, the objective brain data, particularly from non-REM sleep, strongly hints that even when you're deeply asleep, your consciousness might not be fully switched off. It could be operating in this measurable state of, well, covert wakefulness.
Yeah, and maybe just to leave you with a final thought, building on that idea of consistency we talked about.
Yeah.
Think about what it means that we're starting to decode something as complex and subjective as having a dream just by looking at electrical signals from a few sensors on the outside of the head. It really suggests that the state of your mind, your conscious experience, even when it seems completely hidden or absent during sleep, leaves this surprisingly complex, surprisingly readable signature in your brain activity. And science is really only just beginning to learn how to read that signature. It fundamentally changes how we can even approach studying consciousness itself.
It's an exciting and maybe slightly unsettling future for sleep science ahead. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.